The strategic momentum was such that Allied bombers were already striking the Bougainville complex and Kavieng before Munda had even fallen. The activation of fighter fields at Munda Point, Segi Point, and Vella Lavella provided crucial support for bombers from Guadalcanal and the Russells. With these excellent forward bases, the Marines and the 13th Air Force could now focus their efforts on the main target, the Bougainville complex. A strategic seesaw was in effect. As the Allied chain of bases in the Solomons and New Guinea grew, the enemy's network of airfields steadily shrank. Tokyo demonstrated it could still push reinforcements into Rabaul during the November and January battles, but its ability to support the broader network of bases was quickly diminishing as its defensive shield on Bougainville crumbled. Allied fighter pilots in the Solomons were also discovering that enemy forces were beginning to conserve their strength. Fighter losses from all causes had been so severe for the entire year that opposing every attack would have meant a rapid destruction of the force. In addition, Bougainville was well within the transport kill zone and had to be supplied by barge. Allied barge busters helped keep Imperial forces short of important supplies. This was another cause for caution, for it lessened the ability to repair damaged planes. Sometimes fighters tried to stay hidden. Sometimes they simply avoided combat. On other days they accepted battle, which always meant losses. However, nothing could hinder enemy anti-aircraft defenses, substandard though they might be. Dangerous against medium bombers, they were more so against SBDs and Avengers. SBD pilot Loy Smith described a mission that went wrong. Our briefing would be a giant map. We always took off in the dark for 30 a.m., M or 5 a.m., M if there was no new information, they'd let you sit in there and smoke and talk. Then some commanding officer would waddle in and say, "This is it." Then he'd point out a gun that was giving us trouble. They'd say, "Quiet that gun." Sometimes. I'm not sure whether they cared how many dive bombers they lost. You just had to quiet that gun because you'd keep the whole field suppressed for a while. Then the fighters could go swooping through there the whole day, strafing and bombing. I can remember a day when there was a raid to Bin by Boynton Squadron, which we shared a field with. They decided to shoot up the tower. It was already on the radio. They took their F for us and shot the tower knowing we had the guns. The next day, the enemy put some mounts there and they knocked down a fighter. And the next day, they called in the dive bombers. It's nice to know you're wanted. At Kavieng, they had these mounts that we were told came off a damaged cruiser. They were right at the end of the runway. I think all 28 of us went up, but they hit us hard and 5 of our planes didn't come back. Then 2 days later, we had to go back after a different squadron had been chopped up. Then some bright intelligence guy figures out that the fire control was on the other side of the runway. We were hitting the wrong place. When you made your dive, you wanted to get through that flak zone as soon as possible. They'd fire away before you made your run. However, as soon as you rolled into your dive, the people shooting at you usually ran for cover until the last plane got clear. Then they'd be back in their revetments shooting again. But now they're shooting at your rear end. I think flak in the South Pacific was a lot less than in Europe, but it picked away at our squadrons. The losses mounted up. When we weren't bombing guns, we'd hit strips. There might be 28 of us on a run. Pretty big attack. If we got those 1,000-pound bombs on the runway, they couldn't fix it in a night. The 500 or 100-pound bombs could get fixed sooner, but we'd still pound away at them. Several TBF squadrons participated in the last offensives. In the Solomons, the torpedoes were left at base and Avengers began glide-bombing airstrips. The TBF carried a good-sized bomb load, so the aircraft was well-suited to pounding airstrips. Like SBDs, however, they were vulnerable to flak. Harold Rainey was in the turret of an Avenger and described a glide bomb run on an airstrip. We bombed airstrips in the central Solomons and then moved up farther after Munda was captured. We'd come in over the target about 10,000 to 12,000 feet and the pilots would align themselves in a straight line. The lead pilot would rock his wings back and forth and then peel off into what they called a glide. Maybe they could have picked a better name because the dive was quite steep. The TBF was a tough plane and could take a fast dive, and we wanted to get rid of our bombs and get out of flak range in a hurry. I'd watch the plane behind me and I could see when the pilot released the bomb with a jerk and it would slowly separate from the plane and descend. Naturally, my real job was to look for fighters. Thanks to escorts, we didn't see many of them. What we did see were black puffs of smoke exploding all around us. At first, they were maybe 50 feet behind us. Evidently, those gunners on the ground weren't too accurate, or maybe we were going faster than they thought. On succeeding trips, these puffs got closer and closer. Sometimes I'd look out my escape hatch and there'd be anti-aircraft puffs that seemed to be exploding maybe 10 or 15 feet away. One time I looked up at the pilot behind us, and just as the bomb separated from the bomb bay, there was a black puff that I could have sworn had exploded in the bomb bay. Fortunately, we all survived that one. One day, they finally hit us. I felt a great jolt. Felt like the plane stopped. My escape hatch blew out and the horizontal stabilizer on the port side disappeared. It was as though we stopped, went up, but then started to fall. It seemed like a long time, but it was probably a few seconds. The pilot called on the intercom asking if everything was all right back there. Myself and the radio man said we were okay. The pilot said, "Hold on. Let's see what we can do with this machine slowly." I felt the plane begin to respond to the pilot's controls. He was trying to pull it up out of the dive. After a bit, we were flying right over the airstrip we'd bombed so many times. After we got to the end of the strip, we were out over the ocean. The pilot decided to try to make it to Rendova. We felt the nose kept coming up, but we continued to go down. Finally, when we reached the island, I looked over my gun and could see trees. I looked down and could see the ground maybe 15 feet below us, but we were flying level. We got back, or I probably wouldn't be talking right now. The landing was not the smoothest in the world. As we wobbled from side to side, we pulled over to our revetment and got out. We were very glad to feel the ground. That was the last time that plane made a mission. Under the weight of mass attacks, the Bougainville bases began to collapse. In July 1943, Rabaul had integrated 150 aircraft from Carrier Division II into the 26th Air Flotilla and sent them to relieve the already battered units at Bin. Masatake Okumia was at Bin during those dark hours for the Empire. He watched with horror as malnutrition began to affect the eyesight of his pilots and the health of his entire unit. He described conditions in September. The continual air battles against the savagely fighting Americans exacted a heavy and steady toll on our men. The constant fighter plane interceptions and bombing missions meant that hardly a day passed without men dying or receiving serious wounds. The pilots and air crews did not honestly expect to survive their duty tour, for the steady loss of men meant that no one could predict the time of his own passing. I could not understand the attitude of our Navy command, which treated its men with unnecessary harshness and apparent disregard. Of the 150 aircrew members who had arrived 1 month ago with me at Bin, at least 50 were dead. Before another month passed, we were certain that more than half of the remaining men also would be lost. Here at Bin, we suffered most heavily in the loss of our lieutenant junior grade personnel who formed the nucleus of the fighter pilots. 13 of these men had arrived in the South Pacific 18 months ago. Only one was still alive. Okumia was transferred back to his homeland to help rebuild Carrier Division II before he returned with it in January to participate in the last act at Rabaul. His staff at Bin, however, kept him fully informed of events. In October, Bin was finished. By mid-October, the enemy air raids against the 26th Air Flotilla at Bin had become intolerable. With its base constantly subjected to enemy bombs and strafing attacks, with living facilities reduced to the lowest possible level, and with a mounting loss of supply ships, the Navy pulled out, moving its strength directly to Rabaul. The Navy could not continue to bear indefinitely the ever-increasing enemy air strength, and our position deteriorated rapidly. This was not a move made lightly at Rabaul. Bin, along with Kahili, was the strongest imperial base at Bougainville and expected to be attacked in the near future. If Bougainville was lost, then Rabaul would be open to all-out assault. After the war, American interrogators asked Captain Takashi Miyazaki, a senior staff officer of the 25th Air Flotilla at Rabaul throughout most of the war, at what point the staff at Rabaul thought the Solomons campaign was lost. Miyazaki answered simply, in October 1943, when the 26th Air Flotilla withdrew their planes from Bin. The Torquena landing took place on November 1, 1943. After the expected air attack failed to seriously damage landing operations, an American beachhead was secure within 2 days. Within weeks, 3 airstrips were available on the western coast of Bougainville. The final assault on Rabaul was ready from the point of view of Allied forces in the Solomons. Courtesy of the 5th Air Force, the attack had already begun. In early October 1943, Rabaul appeared to be set up for the kill. The number of aircraft at the base was not much more than 150, and the Bougainville shield, fielding a comparable number of aircraft, was collapsing. Halsey and his officers had planned for the landing at Torquay. MacArthur had decided to take Cape Gloucester and the Araa Islands on the western side of New Britain. Naturally, the two forces promised simultaneous support. Naturally, nothing went as planned. Nevertheless, the air garrison was trapped in Rabaul, could fight until destroyed, flee, or be reinforced. Following the September decision in Tokyo to defend the South Pacific to the last as a means of delaying Allied moves elsewhere, Imperial forces fell into one of their worst air defeats of the war. The 5th Air Force had long attacked Rabaul with great elan, but with mixed results. In the fall, Australian and American engineers developed fighter bases for P-38s on small islands southwest of Rabaul. The bombers needed no help. Bombers based at Dobadura and Port Moresby had a final act to play before being moved north. The first attack on Rabaul took place on October 12, 1943. Unlike earlier raids, this attack was mounted during daylight and was huge. It included more than 100 B-25 strafers, 40 heavy bombers, and a large escort of P-38s. It was a major success but did not live up to expectations. The men attacking Rabaul knew it was well defended. They respected this fact at a time when United States bombers in Europe were defying both fighters and anti-aircraft. Nighttime bombing attacks on Rabaul and accurate reconnaissance gave the pilots of the 5th Air Force an excellent idea that Rabaul's anti-aircraft and fighter defenses were far greater than anything attacked in New Guinea. Rich Walker was a pilot of one of the B-25s on the first attack. Rabaul was the hardest target, without a doubt. It was heavily defended, hard to get to. After a while, you begin to think, well, it's just another mission, but some missions were a lot more dangerous than others, and you knew that. We recently had a reunion and one pilot was talking about looking at the crews before the first raids on Rabaul, and he said those crews looked scared to death. We never thought of it that way, but we wondered how we would have enough courage to get into that airplane. Everybody knew on a tough one that chances were not everyone was coming back. And in the back of your mind you'd think, is it going to be me? But that was normal in our business. You can't believe what you had to fly through at Rabaul. They had 4 airdromes. So there were fighters, all that naval ordnance. It was pretty exciting. In our big Rabaul raid, we only lost one plane. It's shaped like a bowl. We came in from the east to attack shipping in Simpson Harbor. I had the inside element line abreast of 12 aircraft. I knew if any of these guys turned into me, they'd stall me out. So when I came to the turning point, I turned right away. My wing went with me. The others kept on going. So there were only 2 of us heading for the harbor. My wingman was shot down almost immediately. I put it down right on the water and told my co-pilot to hold his feet on the throttle. We went through there wide open on the deck. We lined up on this freighter, the first one that was in front of us. I sure wasn't being choosy. We got to the drop point and let fly. I pulled the stick back and don't have any idea why we didn't take the ship's superstructure with us. We passed so close and right back down to the deck. As we kept flying, we went right over an airfield and got greeted there, too. But we made it through and headed for home. You can see the flak vividly. It's busting all around you, and the flash of the guns on the ground is very visible. Most guys aren't sightseeing. You're much better off to just focus on the target and don't think about flak. Protected by observation posts and radar, Rabaul was difficult to attack by surprise. The October 12th attack, however, was the first, and Imperial forces were not prepared. Strafer pilot Robert Lane encountered, to his advantage, the kind of misidentification of aircraft that both sides suffered throughout the war. On my first mission to Rabaul, we got a green light from a guy in the tower. He didn't know we were the enemy. He was so surprised. We had just come in over the water, popped up over this ridge, and then right in front of us was this airfield with aircraft all over. The guy in the tower probably didn't know a B-25 from a locomotive. He gave us the green light to land. We didn't land. We blew him out of his tower. We dropped parafrags and larger bombs at the same time we were shooting against a low-level attack. There was no real defense. We destroyed many airplanes that day. On the first day, the strafers of the 5th Air Force destroyed at least 40 aircraft. The small number of fighters that got in the air suffered from the escorts. Strafers and B-24s claimed a substantial number of hits against the large merchant and naval force in Simpson Bay. Enemy forces later claimed that only one ship was sunk, but 20 merchantmen were damaged to one degree or another. The 5th Air Force made a number of other raids against Rabaul until the end of November. More planes were caught on the ground and more Zeros killed in the air. However, American losses mounted considerably, with 14 aircraft lost on November 2nd. Admiral Halsey was not happy with this performance when he believed, correctly, that his invasion force was the major target for aircraft in the area. Under most circumstances, the early raids against Rabaul by the 5th Air Force would have been considered a great success. Kenny, however, was a MacArthur man and always willing to promise a great deal, and if the promise was not met, to claim a phantom victory. Kenny's victory claims in his memoirs were seriously inflated. Imperial forces had some very good fortune in October. Attacking Rabaul from Dobadura was a long stretch, and for many days the weather stopped or disrupted 5th USAAF attacks. Had the weather been good, Kenny's forces would have undoubtedly applied the 5th USAF treatment to Rabaul with considerable effect. For the tactics applied to Wewak, Hollandia, and many other bases, it was necessary for the attack to be incessant. In the event, the 5th Air Force made periodic attacks throughout October and early November on Rabaul. Had there been 5 days of good weather, the largest air battle of the Pacific War would have taken place, and the 5th Air Force would have had an excellent chance to win it. Instead, while Halsey was preparing the Torquemada invasion, Carrier Division 1, some 200 aircraft strong, came from Truk to Rabaul along with a large surface fleet. It is one of the great ironies of the South Pacific Air War that Imperial forces reached their peak at Rabaul and nearby bases at well more than 400 planes. In addition, the pipeline of reinforcements continued, and another 150 planes from Carrier Division 2 would come in January. The rabbit was indeed caught in the snare. As events played out, the aircraft of the 5th Air Force probably weakened the Rabaul garrison more by defending their own invasion fleets and fighting over landing zones in New Britain than by attacking Rabaul. The 5th Air Force did prevent the Imperial Army Air Force from fighting for Rabaul. The Imperial Army Air Force could have added at least 400 aircraft to the defense had supplies been adequate. The 5th Air Force continued high-altitude attacks on Rabaul throughout the campaign. As discussed in earlier sections, the Imperial Navy took serious losses in New Guinea before handing the theater over to the Imperial Army in the summer of 1943. In late October, Imperial forces made one of their last major raids on Allied shipping in Oro Bay, failing to do substantial damage but adding greatly to the scores of 5th USAAF aces. In December, MacArthur sent U.S. Army forces against the Arar Islands in southwestern New Britain. Imperial forces attacked the landings vigorously with planes from Rabaul and what was left at Gasmata. The ground defense was skilled but in vain. Dozens of tactical aircraft and fighters died in a useless attempt to prevent the landings. 2 weeks later, the Marines attacked Cape Gloucester on the western tip of New Britain, for the only time under MacArthur's command. Even more aircraft opposed that landing and just as many were shot down. It is likely that Imperial forces lost some 70 aircraft attacking Allied shipping and trying to defend the 2 beachheads. They were planes that Rabaul could not afford to lose when it suffered under the brilliant and vicious assault launched by Admiral Halsey's airmen in the Solomons. It was justice of a sort that the Marine pilots and aircrews who flirted with strategic and personal oblivion during the Guadalcanal campaign were primarily responsible for the final destruction of air power at Rabaul. It was also fitting that their campaign received a tremendous boost from the 13th Air Force, whose original pilots had flown so intrepidly at Guadalcanal in inferior aircraft. The continued assistance of New Zealand's fighters and patrol bombers was greatly appreciated in one of World War II's most polyglot commands. There was also a symmetry in the fact that the last act at Rabaul was initiated by the worst possible occurrence from the Imperial point of view, the return of United States aircraft carriers to the battle. By November 1943, both sides had constructed new carriers. The Americans, however, were launching one large carrier, including escorts, almost every month. Prior to January 1, 1944, the United States Navy launched 8 Essex-class heavy carriers and 9 Independence-class light carriers. The new heavies were improved versions of the Enterprise and carried 100 aircraft. The smaller carriers, designed for speed, armament, and range, sacrificed aircraft strength and could launch 50 aircraft of any type. More of both classes entered service in 1944. Behind them were dozens of escort carriers, which were essentially converted merchantmen that carried between 25 and 40 aircraft, but were slow and could not carry the most advanced Navy warplanes. To this group should be added the ancient Saratoga, which along with HMS Victorious, relieved in late summer 1943, much to the delight of its sweltering crew, from service in the South Pacific, had been Halsey's only active carrier during a tense period of battle in the summer of 1943. Enterprise, America's greatest warship, joined the team in early 1944 as the single carrier that specialized in night combat, the doorway through which carrier aviation had to pass to enter the post-war world. Halsey's brilliant carrier raid was a part of a battle that never was. Relying on valid early war experiences, Admiral Nimitz and subordinates in October 1943 sent the new carriers on raids into the Gilbert and Marshall Islands to see how the new ships and aircraft performed. During that period, the Hellcat was general issue, the Helldiver dive bomber replacing the Dauntless. The Americans were spoiling for a fight. What they did not know was that Imperial forces, with new carriers and carrier groups of their own, were also searching for a battle. When the Americans withdrew from the Central Pacific for the moment, they left behind an enemy fleet that was in pursuit. It was one of the great missed opportunities of the war. There can be little doubt that the Americans would have crushed the enemy and perhaps hastened the war's end. For the moment, however, the United States Navy's new weapons returned to Pearl Harbor with their very limited mission accomplished. For the first time, the Great Central Pacific versus Southwest Pacific debate was coming to the front and center throughout the theater. Indirectly, Imperial forces brought matters to a head with perhaps historic results. In late October, aircraft sighted the Allied fleet that was landing New Zealand troops on the Treasury Islands. This led Admiral Menaichi Koga, the commander of the combined fleet, to send nearly 200 aircraft of Carrier Division 1, the best aircraft available, to Rabaul. Koga also deployed a powerful force of heavy cruisers, hoping to duplicate the Battle of Savo Island off the coast of Bougainville. The battle was already in progress. Despite the misgivings of many officers, Admiral Junichi Kosaka, who was overall commander at Rabaul, sent 2 heavy and 2 light cruisers with several destroyers directly to Empress Augusta Bay on Bougainville. Awaiting him on November 3, 1943, was a United States task force of destroyers and light cruisers. American light cruisers were classified by armament, not by weight, and the new Cleveland-class U.S. cruisers that fought at Augusta Bay carried 12 6-inch guns and 10 5-inch guns and displaced more than 10,000 tons. An enemy light cruiser might be an overgrown destroyer. In a night battle, the United States Navy soundly defeated the Imperial force. Well-aimed fire and a series of collisions brought about by U.S. Navy torpedo attack sunk 1 light cruiser and 1 destroyer and damaged another cruiser and 2 destroyers. The enemy column had to return to Rabaul in complete defeat. The defeated force entered Rabaul and met a column of 8 cruisers that had arrived at dawn on November 5 and were refueling in preparation for a massive attack on the U.S. ships defending Torquemada. Halsey had advanced knowledge of enemy movements and had 2 carriers available and another 3 on the way. Yet to protect Torquemada, he did not have the option of waiting for reinforcements. Although Halsey believed the enemy cruiser force would be inside Rabaul Harbor, he still had to deal with nearly 400 aircraft, many with carrier training, the actions of which he could not predict. Coolly, Halsey sent the veteran Saratoga, which possessed the best-trained air group in the Pacific, along with the new light carrier Independence. Launching east of Rabaul, Halsey relied on ground-based fighters for cover and sent the entire carrier force toward Rabaul. Perhaps 70 enemy fighters were alerted by radar and in the air, awaiting the strike. Realizing the priority, the United States fighter pilots ignored the Imperial fighters and stayed with the bombers, flying with them through enemy flak until the critical seconds prior to attack. Confused for a moment by this unusual tactic and reluctant to enter their own flak in pursuit, the enemy fighters could not touch the U.S. bombers as they undertook their attack runs. Ultimately, The defenders downed 10 U.S. aircraft with probably equal losses, but watched the Saratoga's planes damage 6 cruisers, several severely. Defeated twice in 3 days, the warships withdrew to the dubious safety of Truk. Bougainville was safe. 6 days later, 5 U.S. carriers struck Rabaul. 1 destroyer was sunk. 1 cruiser and 1 destroyer were damaged. Considering the size of the strike, the bag was disappointing. The new task force, which included the new heavy carriers Essex and Bunker Hill, along with Independence, had found few warships to strike and received a warm welcome from enemy fighters. The ships soon came under attack by perhaps 100 of Rabaul's land-based aircraft, most from Carrier Division 1. The counterattack taught U.S. fighter pilots some unpleasant lessons about coordination and ship defense. The first group of enemy attack aircraft slipped through with little interference. Future ace Ted Crosby was on Bunker Hill that day and recalled that the air units had good weapons but were not seasoned. Rabaul was my first combat mission, and afterward, I wondered if I had got the right training. We had combat veterans on the ship, but most of us were new at the game. I just didn't have a concept of what was going on around me. I was flying wing on my division leader like we were on a parade. I was too close. I was mimicking every one of his moves. So I missed what was going on because I was glued to my leader. I never did that again. I backed off to where I could see as much of what was going on as the guy I was flying with. The first thing that scared me was when my section leader shot down a Zero. I'm right on his wing, and the first time I see the Zero, he's going over us smoking. I have no idea of when my leader opened fire because I was tucked in too close on his wing. It was startling to see a burning fighter fly over you and not see what had made him burn. We knew from the radio and we could see them taking off from Rabaul. We could see them taking off 4 at a time. So I was wondering what I was doing wrong. When I backed off, we joined up with retreating bombers, and that kept the enemy away from them. I was sure we had better pilots and better planes, and soon I was proved right. But the first big fight was a learning experience for many of us. The attacking airmen from the new carriers might have had some bad luck on the mission, but their commanders were sharp. Although initially badly protected because of a serious problem in vectoring fighters, the new carriers maneuvered skillfully and avoided all bombs that dropped nearby. It is no doubt fortunate they did not face the pilots who attacked Hornet a year before. Nevertheless, after some very anxious moments, all 3 carriers were safe. Their Hellcats found the rest of the attackers and smashed them. The carrier raid had one immediate effect. Major warships, many limping, left Rabaul. However, the retreat of the combined fleet from Rabaul had far greater ramifications than an end to attacks on Bougainville. A U.S. destroyer flotilla under the legendary Rear Admiral Arleigh Burke finished the surface war in the theater when it attacked 5 destroyers attempting to evacuate Buka on November 25, 1943, sinking 3 without suffering a scratch. Rabaul's commanders knew that another carrier raid was possible, that the 5th Air Force might return, and that a huge offensive was going to come from the Solomons. In December, there were some 50 merchant ships of all sizes in Rabaul landing supplies of all kinds, enough to keep the 60,000-man garrison alive until the war's end. However, the kill zone against merchant ships was established by definition when Imperial warships left. The last merchant ship left Rabaul in March 1944. The Great Base was stripped of its ability to supply complex operations of any kind. Relying on extensive supplies at hand, the only thing it could do was defend its air units for a few weeks and keep its garrison ready for months. Halsey soon left the theater for greater fame, but his operations at Bougainville, followed by the carrier raids, were those of a wizard. By December 1943, Rabaul was alone in the South Pacific, still being hit occasionally by the 5th Air Force. It was also being bombarded by heavy and medium bombers of the 13th Air Force. In early December, the first fighter base was operating at Bougainville. By the end of the month, another fighter base was up, along with a medium bomber strip. The Solomon Air Command could call upon 500 combat-ready aircraft at this time within or close to Rabaul. Standing behind them were excellent reserves. Rabaul was smashed in much the same way that the 5th Air Force had created its victims. However, the grim procedure took longer because of Rabaul's great advantage beyond good anti-aircraft size. The major fields were many miles apart, and neutralizing one still allowed resistance from another. Yet, Rabaul had another advantage. Because it was a base for so long, its garrison was able to collect a quantity of basic supplies that were much more elaborate than normal for an imperial base. Yet, the advantage was fleeting, as the garrison defending the base was so large itself. Some categories of basic supplies were used up quickly, and rations were cut back before the end of January. Nothing imperial forces did made the area safe to live in. Malaria, dengue, and jungle rot plagued the garrison, flyers included. When Carrier Division 2 brought in the last group of effective fighting aircraft, all of its staff was hospitalized with malaria or dengue within 3 weeks. Yet, as long as imperial forces were willing to reinforce the base from truck, this base could serve as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. In December and January, Marine and USAF pilots sunk it. By the beginning of 1944, the Allies were learning much about destroying air bases. 3 lessons were basic. First, major bombing attacks should be heavily escorted by fighters. Until January, a well-run attack on Rabaul would include 2 fighters for every single-engine bomber. Second, the attack should hit every component of the base, air and ground. Making the brutal climate of the area an ally, the attackers should make incessant physical labor a part of life. Turning good fields into swamps with heavy bombs was important. Third, there should be no respite. It was vital to make the fighters fly, the guns fire, and the base's resources dissipate. The Marine and USAF attack on Rabaul brought this system to perhaps its highest peak. Often the escorts would be deadly corsairs flown by the Black Sheep and Jolly Rogers. They might also be the lethal P-38s that covered the bombing raids of the 13th Air Force. 13th Air Force and New Zealand P-40s and P-39s continued to soldier on into this period, even as both were being replaced by corsairs. Because Allied fighters were so numerous and deadly, Rabaul's air officers cautioned their fighters against engaging escorts unless the situation was right. No doubt this was a sound order, but it created at Rabaul exactly the same situation faced by the P-39 fishing fleet of early 1942. The result was predictable. Corsairs, Lightnings, and Hellcats, there were several land-based squadrons active, would cover the flight and, after the attack, would strafe positions. Soon enough, fighters were carrying bombs which they could jettison in case of opposition. They were assuming they would meet none. The targets of the SBDs, TBFs, and fighter bombers were gun emplacements, aircraft on the runway, and shipping. Leroy Smith did not like Rabaul. In the early stages, when we hit Rabaul, it was a real killer. It was worse than Kavieng. We would lose aircraft every mission. It had a mountain and a harbor. There was only one way for a dive bomber to attack those fields and harbor. You had to get low because you couldn't get back high again to clear the next hill. They could bang away at you on the way in and the way out. That long haul out to the open sea was a real tough run. Rabaul was a terrible place. If enemy accounts are at all accurate, Smith was on the mark. Lieutenant General Rimpei Kato, Chief of Staff at Rabaul and head of the anti-aircraft effort, estimated that Imperial forces shot down 400 Allied aircraft during the attacks on Rabaul. He estimated that 100 fell to fighters, 300 to anti-aircraft. 90% were SBDs and other single-engine aircraft making ground attacks. These figures are higher than those found in some U.S. sources. As usual, none are in agreement, but they show the relative vulnerability of a single-engine aircraft when attacking low. The SBD and fighter-bomber attacks were increasingly effective as the basic structure of the 4 major airfields was obliterated. This job was largely up to TBFs making medium-altitude bomb runs and, more importantly, on the medium and heavy bombers of the 13th Air Force. Because the medium-altitude attack, there were no true high-level attacks in the Pacific after 1942. Seems in retrospect inappropriate for a theater without cities and factories, its importance has been badly underrated. Early war high-level attacks on shipping and ground targets rarely succeeded because the targets were so difficult to hit and the number of planes so small. By late 1943, however, the equation had changed. A medium-level run had a great advantage over other types of attack. It was not vulnerable to low-level anti-aircraft. All medium and heavy bombers attacking in daylight had fighter support, so zero defensive attacks were rare and almost welcomed, at least by the escorts. In addition, A 1,500-pound bomb dropped from 12,000 feet penetrated deeply and made an excellent crater. And any facilities identified prior to attack were vulnerable to high-explosive bombs dropped by a good bombardier. Dismantling the fields and destroying the buildings and tents required to keep aircraft in the air thus had a devastating effect in the long run. But in the short run, even a medium-level bombing mission was not something that most crewmen relished. Charles Kalin of the 13th Air Force was on several bombing strikes against Rabaul. When we bombed Rabaul High, we always went in at 12,000 to 17,000 feet for some reason. I don't know why. You'd look around and you couldn't see the other airplanes because the sky was so filled with flak. Why they didn't hit more of us, I don't know. Once we got 97% of the bombs on the runway, or so we were told by intelligence. In this type of mission, it was critical to be close because we all dropped when the leader did. So we dropped very tight. You were within 3 or 4 feet of the leader's wingtip during a bomb run. You had to be for accuracy's sake, with flak going off all the time. Edward Brisk, like Kalin, flew a 13th Yusof B-25 against Rabaul. When we went medium level, you had a lead plane with a bombardier. We flew on his wing and dropped with him. We had some top-notch lead bombardiers. One guy was terrific. One of the worst things is to get on a long bomb run. The 8th Air Force had 5-minute runs. Man, just straight ahead, kill the drift, hold the altitude, and that's deadly flying through anti-aircraft. Our guy was so good he would take us on runs of less than a minute and he hit the target. That's good. I was always happy to see him on the mission, but you would get hit. Flak sounded like little pings, like hunks of metal hitting the plane. The shells would explode and you'd catch little bits of shrapnel. If you took a direct hit, it was all over for your aircraft. There's been a lot of psychological analysis since the war, but at the time, stress and tension were not in vogue. You didn't do any self-analysis. You would just grit your teeth and hold your position in the formation and concentrate on your job. I'd say it was tougher on the crewmen that didn't have a job during the run like I did. When we went on medium-level missions, we left our navigator behind because the lead plane did that. We lost our bombardier with the strafer modifications. But the co-pilot and radio operator really didn't have anything to do during the run. That had to be tense. I was very busy keeping formation and waiting for the lead plane to open bay doors and drop, and the gunners were scanning for fighters. But the movies are pretty accurate. You'd see these black puffs, and if they found your altitude, you'd worry a lot more. But what could you do? You were committed, so straight ahead. After the war, Commander Okumia, who had suffered through the collapses of both Bin and Rabaul, and thus understood well how an imperial base slowly died, discussed with American officers the relative dangers posed by different types of Allied aircraft. B-24s were the most effective on land bases. Because our fields were few, it was the size of the bomb that did the harm. Little ones didn't do much harm. The number of crashes attempting to land on damaged fields was very great after B-24 raids. In a place like Rabaul, where there were many fields, big bombs were not such a determining factor because we could land on an auxiliary field. Bombing effectiveness depends on the target. The main thing that bothered us in operation was having several fields hit at the same time, leaving nothing to be used as an auxiliary. There were many ships sunk by dive bombers. Okumia also discussed the deadly effect that carrier raids had on the major imperial base at Truk, pointing out that they could make multiple raids in a single day. At Rabaul, the carriers launched only 2 raids. However, as the Torquemada bases developed through December, Rabaul in essence had an aircraft carrier on its doorstep and was attacked incessantly by SBDs and TBFs. But they were not the only problem faced by imperial forces. Vice Admiral Junichi Kasaka, the overall naval commander at Rabaul, singled out the B-25 strafers and their parafrags as the most effective weapon against planes on the ground, noting that the low-level attacks did not give pilots sufficient time to get their planes into the air, and they were invariably taken by surprise. Although a 5th USAAF trademark, the B-25 squadrons of the 13th Air Force were also using strafers with deadly effect. Pilot Edward Brisk described a strafer mission over Rabaul. The missed rendezvous between bombers and fighters he described was all too common. However, with the enemy fighter strength wearing down and strafers on the loose, Brisk's unit got aggressive. Low-level runs were risky, but an extraordinary experience. You didn't want to take a hit down there, but you were sure firing back. Several missions we caught them by surprise. You'd see enemy personnel coming out of their foxholes pulling on their pants. We caught them by complete surprise near Rabaul once. We had a briefing and a takeoff shortly after midnight. We were supposed to rendezvous with 40 Navy fighters. The idea was to be near Rabaul exactly at daybreak so we had enough light to see the target. We take off, look down, and see all sorts of lights circling. And off we go, thinking we've got a large escort. There were 2 squadrons of bombers, a total of 24 planes altogether. I was a flight leader. One of the escorts had gotten separated and was flying along and turned his landing lights on, trying to read the numbers on our tail to see which way his flight was. Up toward the Green Islands, we had to turn all of our lights off. We had little blue lights on top of the aircraft, formation lights, but they are very hard to see. So we head toward Rabaul. Dawn begins to break. We look around and we have 1 fighter with us. One squadron leader decided to abort with no cover. Away they went. My squadron leader said, "I don't see any fighters. Let's hit them." We spread out and hit Guadalcanal strip. We were 12 abreast with our 1 fighter. There were a lot of planes on the ground, a lot of revetments. That's when you bore in. When you see something to shoot at, you do it. We dropped our bombs over revetments if possible, then peeled off to make our escape over Simpson Harbor. As we broke over a cliff toward the harbor, we saw a line of ships beneath us that had pulled into Simpson, and they were all shooting at us. That Navy fighter got right down on the deck and started strafing those ships, taking the heat off us, and got out of there. When you start on the run, all 12 machine guns are firing. They quit one by one due to overheating or jamming. In the last 2 or 3 seconds, you've got one gun going putt, putt. But it was extremely exciting. Hard to describe. Once you start a low-level run, there was really no sense in sweating. Everything was so fast and you were very busy. Rabaul did not go quietly, but signs of breakdown were clear by mid-November, with all chance of delivering a defeat to U.S. and New Zealand forces in the Bougainville area gone. Carrier Division 1 began to depart within 3 weeks of arrival. It had lost nearly half of its 180 aircraft and a much higher percentage of valuable attack planes. As should have been obvious to Imperial High Command, the Allied air attack on Rabaul had only begun and would reach a fever pitch in the weeks to follow. That was the logic, of course, of the Torquemada operation. Although the 5th Air Force was occupied on New Britain and at Wewak, again a renewed attack from that quarter could come at a moment's notice. The Royal Australian Air Force began a steady nighttime bombing campaign of Rabaul's installations with Beauforts, adding to the physical and psychological attrition. The combined fleet had left Rabaul, leaving the merchant shipping in dreadful danger. Imperial intelligence realized that the Americans were preparing to strike toward the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, the opening guns of the Central Pacific Drive. Everything argued for withdrawal. Instead, Imperial forces believed they were tying down more forces than they were spending. In the very short run, this was true. However, the weeks or days they were gaining would later be given back in months lost. Industrial production in the homeland, crippled by a miserable system of strategic distribution, could barely keep up with the losses of aircraft. To the end, at Rabaul there were more pilots than planes. Pilot training was being cut back to man the aircraft coming off the assembly lines. Furthermore, those new planes, although technically superior to their predecessors, soon began to suffer from serious problems in workmanship and cut corners due to the lack of strategic resources. Fuel shortages began to plague air and naval forces alike. The merchantmen and aircraft squandered at Rabaul after mid-November 1943 were second-rate in Allied terms, but of reasonably sound stock in Imperial terms. Instead of attempting some sort of deceit, such as bogus planes combined with multiple patrols that would avoid combat whenever possible, which would have kept the Allies bombing away happily at Rabaul for weeks, Imperial forces reinforced. As always, the numbers are not certain. After Carrier Division 1 left the theater, Rabaul still had some 140 aircraft, with a few more still on Bougainville. It is not recorded, but one might assume that an average of 50 replacement aircraft came into the theater during November. Another 40 joined in December. In addition, some 90 aircraft, 70% of them fighters from Carrier Division 2, joined the battle in late January. I would estimate that Imperial forces threw away at least 250 airplanes piloted by some of the best men available for no reason whatsoever, and dozens of merchant ships were sunk and damaged while unloading at and leaving Rabaul. It is difficult to believe that imperial forces needed reconfirmation that SBDs and TBFs could sink ships. Yet they found it in the waters in and near Rabaul. Day in and day out, Allied bombers struck Rabaul. When the Allied machine was rolling, the numbers of attacking aircraft were staggering in South Pacific terms. In January 1944, 263 sorties were flown by B-24s, 180 by B-25s, 386 by SBDs, and 227 by Avengers. Those bombers were accompanied by 1,850 fighter sorties. In the first 3 weeks of February, the sortie numbers are just as startling: 256 Liberators, 263 Mitchells, 244 Avengers, and 573 SBDs. The total fighter sorties declined to 1,600 because enemy interceptors were becoming more difficult to find. In other words, 2,400 bombers of all types, escorted by 3,500 fighters, were over Rabaul during 7 weeks. These figures are for the 13th Air Force and do not include attacks made by 5th Air Force and Anzac units. The consequences for Imperial forces were simple enough. There were roughly 130 aircraft in the 26th Air Flotilla in mid-January. Knowing they were ruined as a force, Koga ordered their relief by Carrier Division 2. Allied reconnaissance did not notice any decrease in Rabaul's strength in this period, so it is likely that the aircrews were flown out by air transport and the planes left for replacement pilots and to serve as a reserve for Carrier Division 2. When Masatake Okumiya returned to Rabaul with Carrier Division 2, he was shocked by the psychological condition of the men he had left a few months before. As Okumiya recalled, now they, the pilots he had led at Bin, were quick-tempered and harsh, their faces grimly set. The fighting spirit which enabled us to ignore the worst of Bin was gone. The men lacked confidence. They appeared dull and apathetic. Okumiya found this decay afflicted everyone regardless of rank. The endless days and nights became a nightmare. The young faces became only briefly familiar, then vanished forever into a bottomless abyss created by American guns. Eventually, some of our higher staff officers came to resemble living corpses, bereft of spiritual and physical strength. Neither did the Navy ever consider the problems of our base maintenance personnel, who for months worked like slaves. They lived under terrible conditions, rarely with proper food or medical treatment. As Okumiya made clear, the men were reacting to a reality of war, not some form of panic. They believed they were losing, and they were right. I found on my arrival at Rabaul an astonishing conviction that the war could not possibly be won, that all we were doing at Rabaul was postponing the inevitable. Our executive personnel at Rabaul were not deluded by promises of future successes. They were experts in military aviation and had personally undergone many engagements. There existed a growing feeling of our helplessness before this rising tide of American might. Despite these convictions, they could only continue to send our pilots and aircrews into combat and to their deaths. Who could blame them then for the mental regression into spiritual apathy and defeatism? Okumiya made an extremely unusual command decision. Under normal circumstances, when one unit relieved another, it was common for the men and squadron leaders to discuss the strategic situation so those experienced in the theater could aid the new men. Okumiya was so startled by the defeatism shown by the men of the 26th Air Flotilla that he dispensed with briefings and sent them to truck immediately. The commanders of Carrier Division 2 and the other planes left at Rabaul did what they could to counter the waves of Allied aircraft. They ordered fighters not to engage a superior force. They began night attacks against Allied bases. Yet, despite all precautions, the force of more than 400 aircraft that had been based at Rabaul in November was down to perhaps 50 by late February. On February 17th, the U.S. carriers devastated Truk with a massive raid. The combined fleet surrendered to the inevitable and withdrew its remaining aircraft at Rabaul to Truk. Some officers talked about a counteroffensive against Rabaul, but it is unlikely that anyone but the true believers took such talk seriously. Rabaul was dead. The death of Rabaul is clear now, but at the time it was not. The base was still in operation and possessed a tremendous garrison. The possibility that the Japanese Empire might try to reinforce Rabaul once again and renew the fight was not out of the question. So bombers of all types continued to pound the base throughout March. Significantly, Allied bomber flights began to fly alone, knowing that the danger came from flak and not fighters. The winding up of the South Pacific Air War took place quickly thereafter. MacArthur was already contemplating very long leaps in his offensive, very afraid that if he did not, Washington would shut down the Southwest Pacific Theater, which was exactly what Admiral King wanted to do. He also believed that Imperial forces were losing their cohesion and that a series of strikes would be extremely effective. In this estimation, he was very correct. So for reasons of personal prestige and strategic flair, MacArthur and Halsey, always the oddest pair of collaborators, quickly demolished what was left of the Imperial position in the South Pacific. The first target was Kavieng, the way station for shipping coming from the Indies or truck to Rabaul. It had a fine port, a powerful garrison, and an airfield and was one of the best defended Imperial bases in the Pacific. But it was the shipping that both Halsey and Kenny were after. A carrier strike in early January netted little. Although busy with their frantic Satyr campaign, much of the 5th Air Force attacked the remaining air power and shipping near Kavieng. 2 ships that were sunk contained invaluable aviation ground crews being evacuated from Rabaul to Truk. At the same time, Halsey's forces seized the Green Islands southeast of Kavieng, tightening the noose around the Bismarcks. In March 1944, MacArthur and Kenny ended the South Pacific campaign for good. North of Kavieng lay the Admiralty Islands. Their possession would do far more than cut off the Bismarcks. They would also provide future actions with one of Ahe's best natural anchorages in the Pacific. Relying on an inaccurate reconnaissance report, MacArthur attacked the Admiralties on February 29 with a small force. Imperial forces were large but badly placed. But U.S. troops landed in a place unexpected by the enemy, and by the time enemy forces were ready for major counterattacks, MacArthur had reinforced his expedition. Kenny sent his fighters and strafers on a withering attack against enemy ground positions. Destroyers of the 7th Fleet stood near to shore and provided artillery support. Within a month, the Admiralties, mainest to many Allied seamen, were secure. Although MacArthur's command had defied almost every convention of war, it had achieved a stunning victory with little cost. To cap the victory, Halsey dispatched a large force to the unoccupied island of Amiro, just northwest of Kavieng. By May 1st, there was a good coral airstrip in operation on Amiro, and Marine fighter squadrons were based there. Strategically, the seizure of the Admiralties and Amiro put the cork in the bottle as far as Rabaul and Kavieng were concerned. Yet, the vicious air campaign that had begun when Imperial forces struck Darwin and Port Moresby, and had consumed enormous blood and treasure by all involved, ended with a whimper. Anzac and U.S. aircraft continued to attack insignificant targets throughout the area until the war's end, tragically losing dozens of aircraft in the process. Completely isolated, Imperial forces at Rabaul, Wewak, and many other places waited in limbo for a final Allied attack, death by disease, or perhaps starvation. In the event, more than half of the 350,000 troops bypassed in the Bismarcks, Timor, and New Guinea lived to return to their homeland. However, the air forces these troops needed to fight an island war were long destroyed. The defeat of the Imperial Air Arm in the South Pacific was final and total. It is never easy to distinguish and rate the differences among the large and small factors in military campaigns. It is even more difficult when attempting to analyze, in this case, a merciless air campaign waged for 2 years in the South Pacific. There were no engagements that determined the outcome of the campaign. And whereas leaders became organizers of victory, once in the air, military aviators faced a version of the infantry squad war every day that weather allowed operations. And in theory, one might simply chart the campaign by following a chronology of the line of battle best represented by seizures and losses of air bases. Yet, by definition, the physical seizure of bases was done by sailors and infantrymen. Thus, the airmen created the strategic preconditions for successful offense and defense. But it is not possible to pinpoint a moment when the tide of the air battle turned. That all reflects the innumerable variables involved in the South Pacific Air Campaign. Technology, widely defined, and especially communications, radar, and aircraft quality, played crucial roles, and relative sophistication changed constantly during the first 2 years of the Pacific War. Both sides refined tactics in attempting to get the most from weapons, yet another important dynamic in the process. Imperial forces and the Allies had to cope with terrain that thwarted and physically sapped man and machine alike. Early in operations, factors that proved so important on the ground were not clear, and they only grew in importance as the enemies settled in for a slugfest. The skills of the pre-war pilots were exceptional on both sides. Yet the quality of training and preparation of young aviators also changed almost imperceptibly. Thus, I think it valuable to sum up my views on the South Pacific Air War and its place within the broader Pacific War. I would also like to offer an opinion as to why the Allied Air Arm, after a 2-year struggle, gained a decisive victory over Imperial forces in the South Pacific. Given Germany's defeat in Russia, Imperial ambitions starting at Pearl Harbor were doomed to failure. No analysis of the Pacific War can start without conceding the proposition that Europe first, the Allies' fundamental World War II strategy to control first the West, then the East, was the correct one. And trying to guess how Germany and Imperial forces might have collaborated had the Nazis won in Russia is only guesswork. When Nagumo's bombers were lurching from the Imperial carriers on December 7, 1941, the Red Army had already started its stunning counterattack against the Wehrmacht outside of Moscow. From the outset of the war, then, Tokyo had very little margin for error. As Hitler's dream of empire expired, so did Imperial hopes for victory. The duration of the larger conflict, however, with its immense human and political consequences, was very much determined by the course of battle in the Pacific. Looking at the larger structure of the war, the conflicts in the Pacific took on an irregular pace. In the first 6 months, Imperial forces expanded much like a blitzkrieg, employing forces that by late war standards would have been small. Their initial odds for success were excellent because the British, Australian, Dutch, and American opponents were disorganized and outnumbered. It is safe to say that no one in Canberra or the Pentagon in the days prior to Pearl Harbor expected Imperial forces to sweep all of Southeast Asia, establish a stronghold on Rabaul, and move against the last Allied outpost on New Guinea by May 1942. With Imperial forces stopped from further extending their maritime line by the disaster at Midway, the Allies counterattacked sooner and more effectively than Tokyo had anticipated. Yet between June 1942 and August 1943, the battle line in the Pacific had changed little. The Allies then captured Guadalcanal and New Georgia. MacArthur and the Australians seized Lae. That was far from Tokyo, and it's no wonder that U.S. troops in the theater adopted the adage, Golden Gate in 1948 was not so different from what was expected in Washington. And many Allied military leaders thought any Pacific War would last 18 months longer than the war in Europe. And many held that belief in June 1944, when the Allies successfully landed in France while the Russians were smashing the Germans in the east. The assumption that Imperial forces would be offering formidable opposition for many months thus permeated Allied diplomacy until the conference at Yalta, even Potsdam to a degree. However, in the year following the twin successes at Lae and New Georgia, the Pacific War moved like quicksilver. The air and naval units that were operating near New Georgia and the Huon Gulf in August 1943 smashed the Imperial barrier in a year. Rabaul, Kavieng, and Wewak were pulverized or isolated by April. Much of New Guinea fell by June. At the same time, the long-expected drive from Pearl Harbor toward Tokyo was underway. The Americans took the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. In June 1944, as Eisenhower's troops were sealing Germany's doom at Normandy, the Americans crushed the Imperial Army and Navy at Saipan. 3 months later, Admiral Halsey and MacArthur were ready to fall upon the Philippines. Unlike New Georgia, Luzon was quite close to the homeland and directly athwart supply lines between the Indies and the home islands. Considering such developments, which were catastrophic for Imperial forces, it is surprising that Washington, London, Moscow, and Tokyo expected the Pacific War to last much longer than it did. I think the major reason for that great error lay in a mistaken appreciation of what constituted the central theater of war in the Pacific as opposed to that in Europe. Marshall and those who believed correctly in Europe first considered the Mediterranean theater secondary. They were correct, in my opinion, and nearly 2 years separated the attack on Sicily from the fall of Berlin. Marshall or any Russian general could have testified that the bulk of Germany's ground forces had not been engaged prior to summer 1943, and that only battle against them would bring victory. The South Pacific, in the context of the Pacific War, appeared to be akin to the Mediterranean theater in Europe, a useful prelude to the real war. In fact, however, the South Pacific Campaign was not the preliminary bout. It was the main event. Yet, that is not obvious if one only counts casualties and numbers. The fact is that the systematic disasters suffered by imperial forces in the South Pacific dislocated the imperial military apparatus and revealed glaring weaknesses that the Allies proved quick to exploit. Failures in the Solomons and New Guinea did not equate to an El Alamein or a Sicily. No, defeat in the jungle tropics was their Stalingrad. It is hard to overemphasize the shattering consequences that the loss of Rabaul and New Guinea had on the imperial army. In 1943, the imperial military had a last chance to redeploy major forces against an anticipated Allied thrust. Like the Americans, imperial forces had been making war plans long before Pearl Harbor. The possibility that the Americans would advance from Pearl Harbor directly toward the homeland was an obvious danger in the long run. In the weeks after Midway, however, imperial forces believed they would have considerable time to rebuild their carrier forces and prepare for another great battle with the Pacific Fleet. Still confident, some firebrands in the Imperial Navy continued to think of limited offensives. The Army, frustrated by the Coral Sea defeat, sent a substantial force to New Guinea to attack Port Moresby overland. King's brilliant but risky move at Guadalcanal was a calamity for imperial forces. Still, it is possible that had Yamamoto, who seemed quick to understand the potential catastrophe building in the Solomons, been willing to roll the dice, imperial forces might have destroyed the marine expedition. It is also possible that had the combined fleet staked the war on a sustained offensive, including a close blockade of Guadalcanal, the Pacific Fleet would have prevailed nonetheless, executing another Midway during the fall of 1942 and thereby psychologically crushing imperial leadership. Yet, considering the huge advantage in shipbuilding capacity held by the United States and the hundreds of U.S. warships actually under construction after Pearl Harbor, 1942 was not a time for imperial forces to play it safe. If a conservative policy was deemed necessary, Yamamoto was unwise to fight for Guadalcanal. Far better to retreat to New Georgia, reinforce the island, and wait for the Americans while assisting the Imperial Army at Buna. Imperial forces were faced with a situation fraught with peril. Either way, as it was, the combined fleet and its ground-based air units allowed themselves to be trapped in a battle of attrition. They sent in forces to Guadalcanal, but never enough to make victory likely. Like so many nations in the past, imperial forces began to reinforce defeat. Imperial forces tried to win Guadalcanal on the cheap, which was the worst possible approach to follow and ultimately the most costly. It was a turn of events so favorable to the Allied war effort that it might have been scripted in Washington. It is ironic that a strategic move initiated by Admiral King, who loathed MacArthur, gave a flawed man but great general the opportunity to put a strategic knife in the ribs of the Japanese Empire. American historians have tended to divide the U.S. Solomons offensive, Navy and Marine, and the drive through the Southwest Pacific, U.S. Army and Australians, along service lines. The imperial commanders at Rabaul and their superiors saw them as two parts of the same campaign aimed at opening the doorway to Southeast Asia. Tokyo hoped that the Imperial Navy could contain Halsey and the Imperial Army could contain MacArthur, yet saw the Allied effort as a comprehensive assault on the maritime defense line. This was no small matter, as the resources of Southeast Asia were the prize Tokyo so coveted that it was willing to take on all of the Western democracies. Without oil, rubber, and rice from the Indies, a modern war economy was not possible, and Tokyo understood that completely. Startling is how poorly the Imperial High Command balanced its defenses against a potential but obvious threat to the home islands with a more immediate danger to Southeast Asia. These calculations were not part of King's playbook. He wanted to tie down Imperial forces, prevent them from extending their perimeter, and force the Pentagon to send more resources to the Pacific. In the event, he succeeded, although not as well as had the perceived imperial threat to Northern Australia in early 1942. Throughout 1942, despite the landings in North Africa, more U.S. forces went to the Pacific than to Europe. However, the Australian and U.S. airmen who held out while New Guinea was under siege established a strategic precedent of great consequence. Imperial forces could not just walk into Port Moresby and grab it. It would take ground units to add that land to the empire. At Guadalcanal, the same military equation applied. Once the U.S. Marines were ashore and the Cactus Air Force in operation, the problem became one for the Imperial Army to handle. It was at this moment that Imperial forces failed to use air power on a level that rivaled Midway. A defeat though it was, because Imperial forces operated from far-off Rabaul and were unable to extinguish Cactus, it became perilous for the combined fleet to operate in the area, and it became hazardous and difficult to bring in Imperial troop reinforcements. This encouraged a short-sightedness and overcaution on the part of the combined fleet which impeded the Imperial troop buildup on Guadalcanal. The ground attacks made against the U.S. perimeter in October failed, and had Tokyo been smart, Imperial forces would have withdrawn to New Georgia at that moment. Instead, they continued to push. As important as the November naval battles were, the combined fleet would have had to defeat the U.S. Navy on a scale dwarfing Midway to prevent U.S. reinforcements from reaching Guadalcanal. The Americans had learned much in 3 months, and a total Imperial victory was unlikely given the forces the combined fleet allocated to the offensive. In the event, the Imperial Navy was defeated in November, which no doubt saved the lives of thousands of Imperial troops scheduled to reinforce Guadalcanal to renew the struggle. U.S. troops were building up at Espiritu Santo and Noumea, and nothing short of a complete Imperial naval blockade could have stopped them from reinforcing the garrison holding Cactus. As it was, U.S. troop strength passed 40,000 in November and 50,000 in December. Additional attacks would have only been met by more U.S. firepower, more U.S. infantry, and larger Imperial defeats. Strategically speaking, in the long run, the greatest significance of the U.S. victory at Guadalcanal was that it enabled MacArthur to go over to the offensive. Most of the fighting and much of the planning in New Guinea was done by General Blamey's Australians, but there can be no doubt that the Kokoda Track epic and the miserable battles near Buna were influenced by Guadalcanal. It seems likely that the Australians would have held Port Moresby regardless of the Guadalcanal campaign because Imperial forces had not committed sufficient troops to win the battle against the rapidly arriving Australian veterans. Getting Allied troops onto the northeastern shore of New Guinea was a different matter. Because the Imperial Navy was deeply involved at Guadalcanal, it allowed the Americans and Australians to acquire a tenuous air superiority over the Buna area. Once cut off from supplies, the Buna area garrison, one of the most fanatic in military history, was destroyed. Still, the Buna campaign did not finish anything. Imperial forces rushed reinforcements to La, but their role, despite tentative plans for a renewed attack, would be defensive. There was no leader in World War II more air-minded than MacArthur. And once Dobadura was secured, at a time when MacArthur's navy consisted of a few fishing boats, yachts, minesweepers, and barges, it became obvious to MacArthur that he could crack open New Guinea in short order. Supported by the Royal Australian Air Force and the Australian Army and a reinforced fleet, MacArthur's forces easily seized La and Nadzab in September. None of this could have been achieved without fighter superiority, the ability to drop bombs on the enemy, and a large zone of air superiority within which the invaluable C-47s could operate. At the same time, Allied land-based air superiority covered a naval amphibious campaign without carriers. By the fall of 1943, it was all too clear to Tokyo that the door to Southeast Asia had been cracked open. Tokyo also knew its industrial economy would collapse if that door was kicked in. In the early part of 1943, a flood of Imperial troops came to New Guinea and the Bismarcks to join a substantial garrison that began to build in late 1942 when ideas still existed about attacking Guadalcanal. These men, at least 350,000 strong, were trapped by Allied air superiority and naval mobility. The possible Australian drive from Darwin into the Indies pinned down another 100,000 Imperial troops awaiting a battle that never came. The Australians, following a different route, made the last Allied landing in the Pacific when they hit Borneo's oil fields in the summer of 1945. Another 400,000 men were fed into the trap when Tokyo ordered major reinforcements to the Philippines. American historians have argued for some 60 years about whether the conduct of the Pacific War was well accomplished or not. In a sense, that issue cannot be resolved. The perfect battle has never been fought, as the inevitable confusion of war, Karl von Clausewitz's friction, makes some misstep inevitable. However, it is a fact that the Imperial Army, as MacArthur predicted from the beginning, put the bulk of its strength into the defense against the Southwest Pacific Drive. Still, MacArthur was able to pen up some 250,000 troops in a de facto prisoner of war camp on New Guinea and another 100,000 in the Bismarcks. The garrisons at Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would have been far larger had the Imperial Army sent more of its field forces into the Central Pacific. By the time Imperial forces faced debacle there, however, any attempt at reinforcement was fraught with peril, as any Imperial ship had to run a gauntlet of submarines and long-range bombers. Had those reinforcements been sent months earlier when it was still possible, the Central Pacific agony that faced American troops would have been very much worse. To put things in perspective, there were more Imperial troops trapped on New Guinea than were deployed in the entire Central Pacific theater. There were as many soldiers trapped on Bougainville as were faced by U.S. ground forces on Saipan and Iwo Jima. There were more regular infantry cut off on Rabaul than were defending Okinawa. MacArthur's forces paralyzed the Imperial Army and forced it into a bit player's role in the Central Pacific Drive aimed at Tokyo. The techniques that allowed this outcome were largely based on the accomplishments of the 5th Air Force and Allied comrades flying in the Solomons. The military techniques pioneered in the South Pacific, heavily dependent upon air power in all aspects, helped MacArthur paralyze Imperial ground defenses at little cost. Although the idea would no doubt have irked King immensely, the chain of events he triggered at Guadalcanal led the Allies to attack the homeland from two directions. Considering the great size of the theater and the difficulty in redeploying forces, the change in Allied strategy endorsing some kind of two-armed pincer was predictable, if not inevitable. It certainly worked. By moving to threaten the Indies, MacArthur ruined any chance for a concentrated Imperial defense in the Central Pacific. The result for MacArthur's forces was one of the greatest victories in modern military history. There are still historians who question the importance of MacArthur's Southwest Pacific offensive. However, the most cursory examination of the deployment of Imperial ground forces in the Pacific theater shows that Tokyo had no doubt that MacArthur's forces threatened the existence of the empire itself. That is why they sent the bulk of the Imperial Army reserves to meet him. When Nimitz moved, it was too late to redeploy. Admiral Halsey's brilliant campaign in the South Pacific was nearly as fruitful. Although painfully aware that an attack by the U.S. Navy might come through the Central Pacific, Imperial forces were much too deeply involved at Rabaul to even interfere with the conquest of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands.